Welcome to Empathy Stories, where every tale brings us closer to understanding the power of love, resilience, and human connection. Today, we dive into the moving journey of Brandon Carter, a man whose life takes an unexpected turn when he discovers he has a daughter he never knew about. Stay with us as we explore a story of redemption, fatherhood, and the courage to embrace a second chance at love and family. Brandon Carter stepped out of the shower, steam swirling around him as he wrapped a towel around his waist. It had been another long day at Daniel's Auto Repair, where he worked as a supervisor, diagnosing stubborn engine troubles, training junior mechanics, and managing endless paperwork left him mentally drained most evenings. But as he toweled off and walked into the living room, he felt a rare sense of calm. He'd planned a quiet night, a simple dinner, maybe some sports highlights on TV, and an early bedtime. Life was straightforward, even if a bit lonely at times. Little did Brandon know, everything was about to change. He settled into his recliner, pulling a newspaper off the coffee table. Brandon had always enjoyed the tactile comfort of print, reading headlines, feeling the pages in his hands. It was his way of unwinding, flipping through. He skimmed past political scandals and sports scores before his eyes froze on a name in the local section. Michelle Harper and Anthony Stevens, killed in a tragic car accident. The words seemed to blur as his pulse quickened. Michelle Harper. Could it be? He scanned the photo that accompanied the article. Her face, framed by her familiar curls, stared back at him. It was her, without a doubt. Memories rushed back, vivid and painful, from 6 years ago when Michelle had walked out of his life. They had burned brightly but briefly, and their relationship had ended abruptly. Brandon leaned back, letting the newspaper slip from his hand. He hadn't seen or spoken to Michelle since the breakup. She had found messages on his phone that revealed his wandering heart, a truth he couldn't deny at the time. When Michelle said it was over, Brandon had let her go, believing she deserved better. He tried to remember what life had been like for him at 24. He had been reckless, charming, and completely unready for commitment. Now, at 30, he was a different man. The thought that Michelle had moved on didn't surprise him. She was the kind of woman who wanted stability, who believed in building a life with someone she could trust. What stunned him was the line further down the article, survived by a 4-year-old daughter. For years, Brandon's breath caught as the implication hit him. Could it be? He did the math quickly, his heart pounding. Michelle hadn't told him she was pregnant when they parted ways. Was it possible that this little girl was his child? His mind raced, but he couldn't think clearly. 1,000 questions swirled in his head. Why hadn't she told him? Did she intend to raise the child alone? And now that Michelle was gone, what did it mean for the little girl? Brandon reread the article, his eyes landing on the detail that the child was now living with Michelle's mother, Evelyn Harper. A quiet determination settled over him. He had to find out if the little girl was his daughter. If she was, he couldn't just sit back and pretend he didn't know. Still damp from his shower, Brandon rushed to his bedroom, pulling on jeans and a shirt. His heart raced as he grabbed his keys and stared at them for a moment. There was no guidebook for this. No step-by-step instructions on how to handle the possibility of discovering a daughter you never knew you had. But if there was one thing Brandon was sure of, it was that he couldn't ignore it. The evening sun dipped low on the horizon as he drove across town, his mind replaying every memory of Michelle and their time together. The thought of a child, a daughter, was both exhilarating and terrifying. And as he pulled up in front of Evelyn Harper's modest home, he felt the weight of responsibility pressing down on him. Brandon sat in his car for a moment, gripping the steering wheel as he stared at the small, weathered house. It was just as he remembered from the few times Michelle had brought him here. The paint was peeling, and the front porch sagged slightly under the weight of years gone by. But tonight, the house felt different. It wasn't just a place from his past. It was the place that might hold the answers to his future. He took a deep breath and stepped out of the car. The air was warm and thick, carrying the faint scent of freshly cut grass and distant barbecue smoke. As he approached the front door, his hands trembled. He hesitated for a brief moment, then pressed the doorbell. The sound echoed inside the house, sharp and sudden, making his chest tighten even more. After a long pause, a faint voice called out from inside. "I'm coming. I'm coming." The door creaked open to reveal Evelyn Harper, Michelle's mother. Brandon's heart sank as he took in her frail frame. Her once strong posture had softened with age, and a nasal cannula looped around her face, connected to the oxygen tank at her side. Yet her sharp eyes, though clouded with weariness, still held the same warmth he remembered. Evelyn stared at him for a moment, her brow furrowing as recognition dawned. "Brandon," she said, her voice raspy but steady. "Is that really you?" "Yes, ma'am," Brandon replied, his voice thick with emotion. "It's me. I just heard about Michelle. I'm so sorry for your loss." He paused, glancing down before continuing. "I read about the accident in the paper, and I had to come. I needed to see you." And his voice trailed off as his eyes flickered past Evelyn to the small figure standing slightly behind her. There she was, a little girl with soft brown curls and wide, curious eyes that seemed to take in everything. She clutched the doll tightly to her chest, her gaze shifting between Brandon and Evelyn. Brandon's breath hitched as he noticed the faint resemblance. Her nose, her eyes, there was no mistaking it. Evelyn turned slightly, following his gaze. She sighed deeply, her shoulders sagging. "This is Layla," she said softly. "She's well. She's the reason I'm still here, doing my best every day." Layla peeked out from behind Evelyn, her small fingers gripping her grandmother's dress. Brandon knelt down, trying to make himself less intimidating. "Hi there," he said gently, his voice trembling with nerves. Layla stared at him, her little brow furrowed, but said nothing. Evelyn stepped aside, motioning for Brandon to come in. "We should talk," she said, her voice heavy with emotion. Brandon hesitated, but finally stepped inside, his heart pounding with every step. The living room was cozy but modest, filled with signs of Evelyn's long life and Layla's presence. A shelf held family photos, and toys were scattered near the sofa. Brandon sat down, his hands clasped tightly as Evelyn eased herself into the chair opposite him. "I didn't know," Brandon began, his voice low. "I didn't know about Layla. Michelle never told me." Evelyn nodded slowly, her eyes moist but understanding. "I believe you. Michelle, she was stubborn, and she didn't talk about it much. When she found out she was pregnant, I asked her about the father, but she wouldn't tell me. She just said it was personal, but I always suspected it was you." Brandon's chest tightened as Evelyn's words sank in. "She's my daughter, isn't she?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Evelyn sighed again, glancing toward Layla, who was now playing quietly with her doll on the floor. "Yes, Brandon, she's yours. I've known it for a long time. And now, with Michelle gone, Layla needs someone to take care of her. I'm doing my best." But she gestured toward her oxygen tank, and the weariness in her expression said it all. Brandon felt a wave of emotions crash over him. Grief for Michelle, guilt for not knowing about Layla, and an overwhelming sense of responsibility. "I want to be in her life," he said firmly. "I don't know how to do this, but I'll figure it out. She's my daughter, and I want to make sure she's cared for." Evelyn gave him a faint smile, her eyes softening. "I believe you, Brandon. And Layla, she deserves to know her father. But take it slow. She doesn't know you yet, and she's been through so much. Promise me you'll go at her pace." Brandon nodded, his throat tight with emotion. "I promise." He glanced at Layla, who was now looking up at him with a mixture of curiosity and shyness. In that moment, he knew that everything in his life was about to change. For the first time, he wasn't just Brandon Carter. He was a father. Over the next few days, Brandon couldn't stop thinking about Layla. The image of her small frame, her curious eyes, and her cautious glances at him stayed with him like a dream he couldn't shake. Every detail of that evening at Evelyn's house replayed in his mind. It was overwhelming, but it also lit a fire in him. He had a daughter, and now that he knew, he couldn't turn back. He couldn't pretend she didn't exist. He spent that weekend preparing to meet Layla again, Brandon wasn't sure what to bring or how to approach a 4-year-old who had just lost her mother. He paced his living room, scanning his phone for advice. Should he bring a toy? A coloring book? What did little girls even like? He finally decided on something simple, a small stuffed bear with soft brown fur and a bright pink bow around its neck. It wasn't much, but it felt like a start. When he arrived at Evelyn's house again, his nerves were as raw as they had been the first time. The house looked the same, but now it carried an added weight. This wasn't just about him showing up to see Layla. It was about proving to Evelyn, and to himself, that he was ready for this. Evelyn greeted him at the door with a warm but tired smile. "She's in the back," she said softly, motioning toward the yard. "She loves playing out there. Go on. She's been talking about you." Brandon's heart thudded as he stepped into the yard. There she was, running across the grass with a stuffed bunny clutched in one hand. Her curls bounced as she giggled, chasing a butterfly that floated lazily just out of reach. "Hi, Layla," Brandon said, his voice light but trembling. She stopped abruptly, turning to face him. Her wide eyes studied him, cautious but not unfriendly. He knelt to her level and held out the stuffed bear. "I brought this for you. I thought you might like it." Layla hesitated, glancing at the bear and then at him. Finally, she stepped forward, her small hands reaching out to take it. She hugged the bear close, her lips curling into a shy smile. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. Brandon felt his chest tighten. That small gesture, a quiet thank you, a faint smile, meant the world to him. "You're welcome," he replied, his voice thick with emotion. For the next hour, he stayed in the yard with her, sitting on the grass and watching as she played. She showed him her bunny, her small collection of toy cars, and even her favorite rock, which she had named Sparkles. Brandon listened to every word, soaking it all in like it was the most important conversation of his life. As the sun began to dip lower in the sky, Evelyn called them inside. Layla ran ahead, her bear tucked under one arm. Brandon followed, feeling lighter than he had in years. Inside, Evelyn poured them both a cup of coffee while Layla settled on the floor with her toys. "She's warming up to you," Evelyn said, her voice filled with quiet approval. "That's a good sign. Layla's not quick to trust strangers, but I think she can sense that you're here for her." Brandon nodded, staring into his coffee. "I don't want to mess this up," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "She's already been through so much. I just want to be what she needs." Evelyn reached across the table, her hand resting gently on his. "You're doing fine, Brandon. Just keep showing up. That's what matters most." That night, as Brandon drove home, he couldn't stop smiling. He felt a flicker of hope, a sense that he was stepping into a role he was meant to play. Fatherhood wasn't something he had planned for, but now that it was here, it felt like his entire life had been leading to this moment. In the days that followed, Brandon and Layla began a routine. On Saturdays, he would pick her up and take her on small outings. Sometimes they went to the park, where Layla loved the swings. Other times, they went to a local diner, where she always ordered a cheeseburger and fries. Each trip was a step forward, a way to build trust and strengthen their bond. One evening, after dropping Layla back at Evelyn's house, Brandon sat in his car for a long time. He thought about how quickly his life had changed. Just weeks ago, he had been alone, living a simple and predictable life. Now, he was a father, navigating the delicate balance of building a relationship with a little girl who barely knew him. As he drove home, Brandon realized that he didn't just want to be a part of Layla's life. He wanted her to know she was loved, deeply and unconditionally. For the first time in years, he felt a sense of purpose that went beyond himself. Layla was his daughter, and he would do everything in his power to make sure she knew how much she mattered. Brandon's Saturdays with Layla became the highlight of his week. Each time he picked her up from Evelyn's house, her tiny smile grew a little bigger, her brown curls bouncing as she ran out to greet him. Slowly but surely, she was letting him into her world, and Brandon was determined to earn every bit of trust she gave him. One afternoon, as they sat on a park bench eating ice cream, Layla glanced up at him. "Do you have kids?" she asked suddenly, her little face serious. Brandon chuckled softly. caught off guard by her question. Well, he said, pausing to collect his thoughts. I do now. Her eyes widened slightly, and she looked at him for a long moment before breaking into a giggle. It was moments like these that made Brandon realize how precious and fragile their bond was. He didn't push, didn't overwhelm her with explanations. He let her come to him in her own time. Back at home, Brandon found himself putting more effort into preparing for Layla's future. He wanted her to have a space where she felt safe, loved, and at home. One evening, he stood in the spare bedroom of his modest house, staring at the blank walls. This was going to be her room, he decided, and it had to be perfect. Over the next week, Brandon worked tirelessly to transform the room. He painted the walls a soft pastel pink, carefully choosing a shade he thought would suit her bright personality. He built a small bookshelf and filled it with picture books, stuffed animals, and a few colorful trinkets he thought she'd like. The finishing touch was a bed with a princess-themed comforter, complete with matching pillows. When the room was finally done, Brandon stepped back and felt a wave of pride. It wasn't just a room, it was a promise. A promise that Layla would always have a place where she belonged. The following Saturday, Brandon decided it was time to show her. He picked Layla up as usual, but instead of taking her to the park or the diner, he drove her to his house. She clutched her bear tightly, her big eyes scanning her surroundings as they pulled into the driveway. This is my house, Brandon said softly as he opened the car door for her. I thought you might like to see it. Layla hesitated for a moment before taking his hand. As they walked inside, she looked around curiously, her eyes lingering on the photos on the wall and the small details of his life. Brandon led her down the hall to the spare bedroom, his heart pounding in anticipation. When he opened the door, Layla gasped. Her eyes lit up as she stepped inside, taking in the pink walls, the bookshelf, and the princess bed. She ran to the bed and jumped onto it, giggling as the comforter crinkled beneath her. Do you like it? Brandon asked, kneeling beside her. Layla nodded enthusiastically. It's so pretty. Is this my room? Brandon swallowed hard, emotions welling up in his chest. Yes, sweetheart, he said, his voice thick. This is your room. It's all yours. Layla threw her arms around him, her little hands clutching the back of his shirt. Brandon held her tightly, feeling the weight of the moment settle over him. For the first time, he felt like he was truly her father, not just in name, but in the way that mattered most. After that day, their relationship grew even stronger. Layla began spending more time at Brandon's house, watching TV with him, playing with her toys, or simply chatting about her day. She was blossoming, and Brandon couldn't help but marvel at how much joy she brought into his life. But beneath the happiness, there was still a lingering sense of unease. Brandon hadn't told Layla the full truth yet. He hadn't explained that he was her biological father, and he wasn't sure when or how he should. Evelyn had encouraged him to take things slowly, and he knew she was right. Layla had already been through so much loss, and the last thing he wanted was to overwhelm her. One evening, as they sat on the couch watching a cartoon, Layla leaned against him, her small frame warm and relaxed. Brandon looked down at her, his heart swelling with love. He didn't have all the answers yet, but he knew one thing for certain. He would always be there for her, no matter what challenges lay ahead. Layla would never have to face them alone. For the first time in years, Brandon felt like he had found his purpose. He wasn't just a man going through the motions of life anymore. He was a father, and that role meant everything to him. A few weeks after Layla saw her new bedroom, she began spending more nights at Brandon's house. The once quiet home was now filled with her laughter, the soft padding of her footsteps, and the colorful chaos of toys scattered across the living room. Brandon felt his life shifting in ways he hadn't anticipated. Each day brought new moments of connection, small but meaningful signs that Layla was beginning to trust him completely. One Saturday morning, as Brandon brushed her soft brown curls and tied her shoelaces, Layla asked, "Are you my dad?" The question stopped in mid-motion. His hands stilled, his heart pounding. "What makes you ask that?" "Sweetheart," he said gently, crouching down to her eye level. She shrugged, her small face thoughtful. Grandma says you love me a lot, like a daddy does. Brandon felt his throat tighten. He had known this moment would come, but he hadn't expected it so soon. He reached out and tucked a stray curl behind her ear. I do love you, Layla, more than anything. Then are you my dad? She repeated, her gaze steady and unwavering. Brandon took a deep breath. Yes, Layla, he said softly. I'm your dad. For a moment, she simply stared at him, her wide eyes searching his face as if trying to piece everything together. Then, without a word, she threw her arms around his neck, hugging him tightly. I knew it, she whispered. Brandon held her close, tears stinging his eyes. I love you, Layla, and I'll always be here for you. Always. As the weeks turned into months, Layla began calling Brandon Dad without hesitation. It filled him with a pride and joy he hadn't known was possible. He poured himself into being the best father he could be, balancing his full-time job at Daniel's Auto Repair with the demands of parenthood. His evenings were no longer his own. They were filled with bedtime stories, helping Layla with her art projects, and making her favorite spaghetti dinners. But even with the happiness Layla brought into his life, Brandon couldn't deny the ache of loneliness that crept in during the quiet moments. He had devoted himself completely to his daughter. But sometimes, when the house grew silent after she fell asleep, he missed having someone to share his life with. That loneliness began to fade the day he met Olivia Taylor, Layla's teacher. It happened during a parent-teacher conference, a routine meeting that quickly became anything but. Olivia was warm and engaging, with a natural kindness that made Brandon feel instantly at ease. She spoke about Layla with genuine affection, praising her creativity and resilience. Brandon couldn't help but admire Olivia's calm confidence, the way she seemed to truly care about her students. As their conversation shifted from academics to more casual topics, he found himself laughing at her quick wit and feeling a spark he hadn't felt in years. By the end of the meeting, Brandon had worked up the courage to ask her out for coffee. To his surprise and delight, Olivia agreed. Their first date was simple but meaningful, a quiet evening at a cozy cafe where they talked for hours. Brandon opened up about his journey with Layla, and Olivia shared her own stories about growing up in a big family and her dreams of making a difference as a teacher. It wasn't long before Olivia became a part of their lives. Brandon introduced her to Layla slowly, careful not to rush things. To his relief, Layla warmed to Olivia quickly, drawn to her gentle demeanor and playful spirit. Olivia often brought little gifts for Layla, coloring books, stickers, or homemade cookies, and Layla began looking forward to her visits with a shy but growing excitement. One evening, as Olivia helped Layla with a puzzle at the kitchen table, Brandon watched them from the doorway, his heart full. This was what he had been searching for, not just a partner for himself, but someone who could share in the love he had for his daughter. As Olivia tucked Layla into bed that night, Brandon felt a quiet sense of contentment settle over him. Life wasn't perfect, but it was good. He had a daughter who adored him, a partner who understood him, and a future that finally felt bright. For the first time in years, Brandon allowed himself to dream of what could be. He saw family dinners, birthday celebrations, and vacations to places Layla would never forget. He saw a life where love, laughter, and hope outweighed the struggles of the past. And as he kissed Layla goodnight, he whispered, I love you, sweetheart. I love you too, Dad, she replied, her voice sleepy but full of trust. In that moment, Brandon knew that no matter what challenges lay ahead, he and Layla would face them together with Olivia by their side. If they were lucky, they had found each other in the unlikeliest of circumstances. And now, they had everything they needed to build a life filled with love. Thank you for joining us on this heartfelt journey through Brandon Carter's story of discovery, love, and transformation. At Empathy Stories, we believe in the beauty of human connections and the strength found in life's most unexpected challenges. If this story moved you, please like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more stories that inspire and uplift. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Your voice makes our community stronger. See you next time.